Breaking news, the Big Ten is getting bigger, and it's going out west. USC and UCLA are planning to leave the Pac-12 for the Big Ten, according to our Matt Norlander. Both teams in Los Angeles. The closest school in the Big Ten to Los Angeles, Nebraska. That is how far away those two teams are from the rest of the Big Ten. Now, we've had seismic shifts all over the world of collegiate athletics over the last couple of years. It really all started with Texas and Oklahoma announcing that they were going to join the SEC. Then the Big 12 countered by adding Cincinnati, UCF, and Houston, along with BYU. Those teams will join that conference next year. The report from Pac-12 country is that USC and UCLA could join the Big Ten as early as the 24 season. All right, so for more on this huge breaking news, let's bring in a couple of our best. Tom Fornelli and Barrett Sallee joining us here. Tom, really a Big Ten guy. Barrett, you're an SEC guy. Barrett, I want to start with you. This has to be a direct reaction from the Big Ten after the SEC got Texas and Oklahoma, is it not?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. When the SEC got Texas and Oklahoma, I think the rest of the college football world looked around and said, well, where can we go if we can get to 16? And the Big Ten making a big jump across the country to get to of the more prominent programs in all of college football, not just college football, but all of college sports. So I don't think there's any doubt. If Texas and Oklahoma had not joined the SEC, then Kevin Warren, the commissioner of the Big Ten, would not be looking across the country for these two programs. But when that domino fell, when Texas and Oklahoma fell, we saw, just like we saw 10, 12 years ago, the dominoes fall all over the place. And if you're the Big Ten, you need to keep your foothold as the second best conference, the second most powerful conference in all of college athletics, and they're absolutely going to accomplish that goal.
Tom, how big is this for the Big Ten, which went from 10 to 11, and then to 12, and then to 14, and now 16?
Oh, first of all, it's terrible for the alliance. I don't know what's going to happen between that with the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, but it's a huge move. I don't think we're done here, because realistically, if USC and UCLA are joining the Big Ten, like you said, the closest Big Ten school right now to those two in Los Angeles is Nebraska. I don't know if they want to join the conference thinking that they will be the only two West Coast teams in the conference in the long haul. So I wouldn't be shocked at all to see another couple programs, maybe Oregon or Washington, joining the Big Ten as a follow-up to this. But as far as the Big Ten, like Barrett was saying, I think that this is somewhat of a necessary move considering what the SEC did by going out and getting Texas and Oklahoma. And I think if we go back to, over a decade ago to when the conference realignment really started kicking into gear, that saw the Big Ten expand from 10 to 11 to 12 to 14, that saw the SEC expand to 14. Two super leagues has kind of been the most likely endpoint for this ever since that happened. And if you look at television deals and things that are going on, the SEC recently signed a very large television deal. The Big Ten is in negotiations right now for a new television deal that will probably see it getting even more money than the SEC just got. And you look at that compared to what the ACC, Big 12, and the Pac-12 have been able to get from their television deals or will be able to get. I think this is just a natural reaction. Big brands like UCLA and USC are going to want to join the Big Ten in order to survive in a college football future that is probably going to look a lot different than the college football past that we've become accustomed to.
Okay, so it looks like two super conferences right now. Barrett, is this it for the Big 12, for the Pac-12?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt the Pac-12, I mean, look, there might be some iteration of it, but we're going into a new era. We've talked about expanded college football playoffs. That obviously hasn't happened yet, but I think the message across the college athletics world is clear that you either need to be a have or a have-not, and you need to make that jump as quickly as possible. And right now, the Pac-12, Tom mentioned, if you're Oregon, if you're Washington, you're looking around going, where do we fit in? If you're Arizona and Arizona State, you're wondering, like, hey, look, we're prestigious institutions. Where do we go? So the Pac-12, I think, would still exist, but I think we're looking at more of a fracture of FBS football where you have group of five, you have something else in between that and this super football league that right now, like Tom said, there absolutely should be more expansion. I think there will be more expansion because teams like Florida State, teams like Clemson, all over the country are looking around going, how stable are we right now? So yes, I do think the Pac-12, it'll exist, but it will not be a powerful conference anymore because they're going to obviously have to fill these voids, and there's really nobody else left to fill them with.
Amanda Guerra just slipped me a note. The closest game that either one of these teams could play outside of that state against one another, they would have to travel over 1,500 miles to Nebraska to play the Cornhuskers. Of course, you have Maryland and Rutgers all the way on the other coast. Tom, why doesn't geography matter anymore?
I don't know. I guess, that flights are cheaper now than they used to be a few years ago. And I also think that, honestly, like we're talking about the money that these schools have been able to get from their television deals. It used to be you didn't want, geography mattered because travel budgets did matter. Travel budgets don't matter anymore. These schools can afford to travel all over the country, or at least the football programs can. What becomes of the Olympic sports who aren't generating nearly as much revenue as football? I'm guessing UCLA and USC might have other plans than joining the Big Ten in volleyball or any other non-revenue sport. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts it. But as far as football, money's no object. We've seen that. We've learned that over the last few years. The Big Ten is now going to be from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It doesn't matter anymore.
Usually this time of year, you don't have a ton to talk about on the Cover 3 podcast. You always do a good job coming up with interesting stuff. We just did you a huge favor. Matt Norlander confirming the news that USC and UCLA are headed to the Big Ten. Check those guys out, Tom Fornelli and Barrett Sallee, and many more on the Cover 3 podcast, all things college football. But again, this is not just college football that's changing. USC, UCLA joining the Big Ten in other sports as well as early as 2024. That's 2 years away.
And we are following major breaking news out of college athletics where the Big Ten is now expanding west. USC and UCLA planning to leave the Pac-12 for the Big Ten as early as 2024. That is the latest, according to our Matt Norlander, who confirmed the news for us this afternoon. This signaling, of course, the latest seismic shift in conference realignment on the heels of Texas and Oklahoma deciding to head to the SEC. So here's a look at the new look Big Ten Conference, adding in USC and UCLA. They would now have 16 teams that would match the number of teams that the SEC will have once Texas and Oklahoma join them as well. Let's welcome in two of our experts who are in Los Angeles right now, the place to be apparently for the Elite 11 Day 3. We have Josh Pate and Bud Elliott there. Josh, I want to start with you. I mean, did the rumor mill start to heat up when this news started to trickle down on social media? What was the vibe out there?
Well, it was one of those rare mornings where I ate breakfast, and so you're standing in the breakfast line, and you get there, and no one's whispering, and by the time you're checking out, everyone's whispering, and it's crazy that you're in Los Angeles, Bud, this morning, because there are a lot of people here. There are team officials, there are conference officials, there are people who have worked with the Pac-12, used to work with the Pac-12, and it just sent this immediate reverberation and ripple effect out, and the consensus reaction was, well, there goes the Pac-12. You know, the Pac-12's done. That's almost like an afterthought now. But, Bud, like immediately, I think everyone's mind shifted in a couple of directions. You're either in the media rights camp, where you're just talking about the business side of things, or you're in the conference realignment camp, where most of our minds are, and you're thinking, okay, the SEC's made their moves, and then the Big Ten just made a huge couple of counter moves. This is not checkers. That's very much a chess move on the part of the Big Ten. And then you kind of say, and what? And who gets left out? And who's included? And to me, it all comes down to like how many seats at that table are there. You know the SEC's got one. Definitely the Big Ten's got one. But as for the rest of the country, in my mind, there is clearly room at the table for a third, if you want to call it, super conference. Because like you and I were talking about before we went live, FSU's going to be there somewhere. Oregon's going to be there somewhere. Oklahoma is obviously moved already. But there are still enough brands out there, I think, to create a third big seat at that table.
Josh, this is an absolute gift from the content gods, right? Will it be just two enormous conferences that maybe have 20 teams each? Is the SEC done? Maybe we'll have a third conference, which is some combination of the ACC, Pac-12, and existing Big 12 once the Oklahoma and Texas schools go to the SEC. And what about the college football playoff? They declined to expand. We thought it was done this summer. Maybe there were some things already in the works. Deals like this don't come together in just mere days. A lot of stuff to talk about here.
Yeah.
So, Josh, I mean, you're saying, look, I think there's room for a third super conference, if you will. I mean, the big thing on social media right now is you hear a lot of people say, look, the Pac-12 is done. The Big 12's got to be licking its chops here. So what is the next move in regard to these two conferences?
Well, the thing to keep in mind with the current rumor and speculation in our industry, which I don't think concerns fans a whole lot, but all of a sudden it's at the forefront, has been this Big Ten media rights deal. You know, we're wondering, is CBS in the game? Is another major conference and network in the game? But I think the big talking point out west had always been, okay, once that subsides, then the Pac-12's renegotiation window was coming up. And a lot of people on the West Coast thought, wow, we're going to be able to probably reap a big financial windfall from whoever didn't get that Big Ten deal. And all of a sudden you're asking yourself, well, what's the Pac-12 deal worth? Or is there more radical realignment coming that creates a lot more attractive ACC? The ACC's got that grant of rights deal right now, as you well know.
2036. Yeah.
And so there's so much that you wake up every morning thinking is concrete, and then by the time you go to bed that night, it looks like a totally different world. But I do think that the next big talking point, especially within the business side of the college football industry, is the Big Ten media rights deal when it gets announced, and then the subsequent. Because you've got more media rights deals coming up. The Pac-12, like I said, was coming up. Where do they go, and how attractive a product is that at this point?
Bud, let me ask you this. What do you think the Big 12 does now? What's their next move?
So the Big 12 has Texas and Oklahoma for, 2 more years? They might get out of it a little bit earlier than we think. But I think if you're the Big 12, maybe you reach out to the Pac-12 and say, hey, Pac-12, you still have some nice brands. You still have some attractive media markets. And if you're able to go and do that, maybe you're able to convince Oregon with a higher share of conference revenue than they're normally getting from the Pac-12 to come and join. That would be my move. I don't think you want to keep adding smaller programs. Maybe you prey on Oregon's desperation. Maybe you take Oregon and Oregon State as a bit of a package deal. But they're in an interesting situation here. I think they have more leverage than they did before today, obviously, because previously they were by far the worst recruiting conference once you take out Oklahoma and Texas. Nobody in the new Big 12 recruits at that national title level, or even really close to it. If you're able to combine some schools from the Pac-12, at least you increase your market share in a region that is now not really represented in the Big Two conferences, with the exception of the LA schools.
This is clearly, reshaping the college sports landscape as we talked about it. I mean, first it was just the SEC with Oklahoma and Texas. Now USC, UCLA joining the Big Ten. Josh, with this entire reshaping that we're seeing, because it's nothing less of that, is this good for college athletics or bad?
It's the multi-billion-dollar question right now. I've already asked a couple of people that this morning. It totally hinges on how much you appreciate maybe the tradition and history-rich aspect of college athletics, or whether you look at that and say, that's romanticism. You know, that's a fairy tale book, but that's in the past. You've got to use windshield thinking instead of rear mirror thinking. If you're of that train of thought, and I kind of obviously have a foot in both camps, you can tell I'm a little conflicted. I would love for there to have been a world where everything just stays the same for about 10 years. It seems like that never happens in college athletics. But once it became pretty apparent, especially this time last year when OU and Texas left the Big 12 or announced that they were, that wasn't in the cards, then I think a lot of us, myself included, just kind of accepted what reality was. And you knew that anyone who told you, all right, OU, Texas, done, that's the end of conference realignment, that was foolish. You knew that there was one, if not two more tidal waves coming. I think we're in the middle of those two tidal waves right now. And wherever we finally rest, what I hope is that there is enough of the fabric that, people like me grew up loving about the sport. I hope that there's enough of that we still look at the college football product in 2030. Once you've got your new playoff and once every conference is realigned and you say, yeah, this kind of looks like college football still. I mean, I guess I reassessed expectation, and that's now the hope.
I really don't think that the number is going to be 30, right? We need some teams that are willing to sign up and take losses. So if you think about this, if you're in Arkansas and you're playing an SEC-only schedule from now on, if they were to go into a super conference model like that, what are you finishing every year? 4-8? That's really not fun. There will always be teams that are willing to bet on themselves, take a check, and take some losses. So I do think that there's a lot more moves coming here. I really don't see us ending up at just 30.
Let me ask you guys this. Obviously, you're out there at 11 right now. We are talking to you about that later today. We've been catching in with you every day. I want to talk about what this means for recruiting, and then especially when it comes to these two schools, because you saw guys at USC, obviously Lincoln Ryland, Caleb Williams going there, and it seemed a much easier path for them. And to get these guys to come over to USC, hey, look, you know, we're going to own the Pac-12. We're going to get to the playoff at some point there. But for these schools, how does this impact their recruiting?
I think it only helps USC and UCLA's recruiting. Now, while it is true that they're not going to be as close to their parents, and you know they'll probably be pretty high in their Sky Miles accounts if this thing goes through, if they want to watch their kids play road games. What's the alternative? You really can't stay in LA if you want to play in a real major conference now once USC and UCLA leave the Pac-12, pending its new alignment. And they're going to get a lot more money out of this deal. The Big Ten laps the Pac-12 in terms of funding, and UCLA definitely needs that. USC has quite a bit of cash on hand already, but I think it only helps Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly in recruiting.
Josh Pate, I want to knock that same question over to you.
Well, my big question, really, when the SEC made their move and the Big Ten, whether they had made moves or not, had a new media rights deal coming up. But my big question has been, when you look at the increased size of that media rights revenue pie, whether players were going to get any access to that. Because there are really two differing schools of thought here. One was NIL. You take your chances on that market, and if you can make something, then good for you. And then there was another train of thought, and a lot of coaches buy into this, saying, wait, we're making how many hundreds of millions of dollars? Like, Amanda, just for reference, it's estimated that each Big Ten and SEC member institution will soon be cashing $100 million per year paychecks just from media rights. And so coaches have looked at it and said, why don't we just learn to distribute revenue a little bit, where if I'm Arkansas, or if I'm UCLA, or if I'm Oregon State, in another world, we can at least somewhat inject some, if you want to call it artificial parity or competitive balance, call it that, but inject that into our game. Well, now I look and I wonder, with what this media rights deal is worth with the Big Ten, with what it is worth in the SEC, I still wonder if that's on the table. Because to me, one of the only plays out there to counter the, as Bud said, massive recruiting advantage you have now as being part of the Big Ten and the SEC is if someone gets creative and they enter into a new media rights deal of their own. Let's just call it a third super conference. And this is way out there thinking, I admit that. But if there is a world where a media partner and that other conference agree to do something that maybe the Big Ten and the SEC aren't willing to do, and that is enter into revenue sharing, that may be the only logical counter I could see at this point. Because if it's just apples to apples, Bud's right. There is no counter. It's just game over. It's just checkmate.
Josh Pate, Bud Elliott, we appreciate it. I know this is not what you woke up this morning and thought you were going to be doing there at the Elite 11 finals, so we appreciate you guys hopping on with us with all of your insight into this breaking news. Again, USC, UCLA headed to the Big Ten as early as 2024. Those are our partners there at 24/7 Sports. I also want to mention Josh Pate, of course, his very popular show, Late Kick with Josh Pate, a new episode coming down this afternoon. Make sure to check it out.
Coverage on USC and UCLA leaving the Pac-12 for the Big Ten. Our Matt Norlander has confirmed that news. Several reports that they could be joining the Big Ten as early as 2024. So that would be 2 years away. These are two historic programs in college football and two programs that have been in the Pac-12 or similar. It was then called the Pacific Coast Conference. For 100 years or so. The USC joined the Pacific Coast Conference 100 years ago exactly. UCLA joined 94 years ago. And now they are looking to move to the Big Ten. That would mean 16 teams in the Big Ten to match the SEC's 16, with Texas and Oklahoma joining the fold. Let's bring in our Dennis Dodd, who covers both college football, college basketball, and all college athletics for us at CBSSports.com. Dennis, a lot of us blindsided today by this seismic move in college athletics, but if we've learned anything over this last year, 2 years, decade, it's that we should always be ready for something like this. What more can you tell us about the move?
Yeah, right. This makes Texas Oklahoma look like child's play. At least we knew they always had options because of who they were. USC and UCLA breaking a bond that goes back almost a century with the Pac-12 for the Big Ten, it just kind of confirms what's happening now. It's coagulating at the top. We have confirmed that they are at least in discussions, that this could happen as early as 2024. My first question is, I'm thinking about a guy like Lincoln Riley. He had to know about this when he interviewed or thought about USC in December. He had to know this was a possibility, and goes a long way towards answering the question, why did he leave? I had one administrator just tell me that as far as he's concerned, the Pac-10, what is now the Pac-10 and the Big 12 look more like the American right now. And if you want to talk about those 30 schools, you want to talk about a breakaway, we're witnessing it right now. No, they're not going to be 30 schools playing by themselves, but I think in the future, Chris, it's going to be those 30 plus whatever, 50, 30, whatever, that step forward and play on that level, commit to that level in terms of revenue. So this has obviously been going on for a while. I just talked to a Pac-12 AD who was extremely upset. We have to know that this was kept a secret from everyone in the league for a long, long time, and from Commissioner George Kliavkoff, who's in the middle of negotiating a new TV rights deal. So this was bound to happen, Chris, with I call it the last helicopter out of Saigon syndrome, with those schools in the Big Ten and the Pac-12 making $80 million when the dust settles in their new TV rights deals. It was going to be whoever else wants to join them, and obviously USC and UCLA had the juice to do so.
So we know the TV contracts and the streaming rights drive a lot of this. And right now, the Big Ten is involved in that. How do you even go about these negotiations when maybe one or both sides don't know who's actually going to be in the conference?
Well, because when the SEC did their deal last year, last July, when word leaked of Texas and Oklahoma, there's a reopener in the contract which allowed them to renegotiate. So in 2024, I think the year is when Texas, Oklahoma joined, that number is going to go up to 80 million per school, or at least that's what industry sources say. Now, for the Big Ten to keep up, and that's what a lot of this is, it's merely keeping up with the Joneses. They were going to have to add. Now they have 16 schools. Now they're going to have $80 million each. At some point, they reached out. When Texas and Oklahoma happened, Chris, there were only a handful of schools in terms of realignment that had the leverage and the juice to make a decision. USC and UCLA were two of those. Maybe Washington, maybe Oregon, definitely Clemson, Miami, and Florida State. And I think that's the next question that has to be answered. Have they given the SEC a call to join? Now, there's a grant of rights in the ACC, but we always know that things can be worked out in court. We've seen it over the last 10 years. So I think those are the next dominoes to pay very close attention to as these super conferences, tend to coagulate and form at the top. Will there even be a Pac-10? Does it merge with the Big 12, what's left of the Big 12 now, and they form their super conferences? All those questions are on the table.
And the decision makers for the three conferences that as of right now are left out of what we're calling the super conferences now, the Big 10 and the SEC, you've got the Pac-12, Big 12, ACC, and if I'm not mistaken, Dennis, they all have commissioners that have what, maybe a year at most on the job?
Yeah, the Big 12 does not have a commissioner. They just named Brett Yormark, who's due to come in any day. I think I talked to Bob Bowlesby today. He's leaving August 1st, so there's a transition period then. So not only is that new commissioner going to have to do a new TV deal, but now probably deal with realignment. There's going to be reaching out from the Pac-12, from the Big 12, I would suspect, to the Pac-12 to see what kind of relationship they can do there. Jim Phillips in the ACC actually is in the best position right now. They have a TV contract that goes through 2036. They have a grant of rights. I mentioned Clemson, Florida State, and Miami. They'd have to get through that, but they have a solid membership now. Maybe the money isn't very big, but that's going to work itself out. We're going to see how that plays out with those top two conferences. So, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough competing against those two conferences. They're going to have resources to not only do whatever they want, to recruit better than everybody else, but now dictate policy. Just think about this, Chris. If those two conferences it's sooner or later, 2024, say, yeah, you know what? We want to play with 95 scholarships instead of 85. There'll be a lot of schools in FBS that can't afford that. And I think we wrote about it in a series this week. I think that's what's going to happen. You're going to see another division form. I don't know if that's the worst thing in the world, that they'll play for less money, but there will be a playoff at that next level. And I think you're seeing FBS break up before our eyes right now.
So we could have playoffs at two different levels here, then, is what you're saying. You could have the super conferences, Big Ten, SEC, having their own playoff, and then the other conferences doing their own thing. I mean, what happens here? What's the impact of today's news?
Well, to me, it's right now, to me, it's not just those 30 schools in those leagues. It's the schools that want to play along and try to reach that level. I don't know what that is. Is it 50 schools? Is it 80 schools? You know, will those two conferences look down their noses at the likes of what the Big 12 is now? I don't know. But as far as that next level, I call it Division 4, if it ever forms, playoff. It was priced. I did a story on it 5 years ago. It was priced at $160 million. Had the group of 5 gone off on their own at that time and staged their own playoff, it would have been worth that. Now, since then, Chris, you've got the tech giants, you've got streaming, you've got Turner, you've got NBC. All of these networks now and streaming are desperate for content. And I know it isn't Texas and Oklahoma and those main schools that we just referred to, but it is content, and it is live content, and that sells. So I think that would be a pretty penny, and I think people would watch it.
All right, Dennis, we're going to let you go. Check your phone. That might have been an alert that Oregon and Washington are leaving the Pac-12 as well. We'll see. That has been suggested that this might not be over, and I think it's far from over right now. Dennis Dodd with us here on HQ. Let's look at how the new Big Ten would look throughout the country. My goodness.
It's crazy when you see it on a map.
I'm old enough to remember when the Big Ten had 10 teams and they were all in the Midwest. Iowa and Minnesota were the teams that were the furthest to the west. Ohio State and Michigan were the teams that were farthest to the east. They added Penn State, then they added Nebraska, then Rutgers and Maryland for some reason. And now USC and UCLA, all the way out there on the Pacific Ocean, are planning to join the Big Ten as early as 2024.
Let's welcome in two of our experts, Danny Cannell and Bryant McFadden here. DK, I'm going to start with you because you put out on Twitter, what is next? So I'm going to ask you that. What's next?
This is the first it's the second domino, right? The first domino we saw last year with Oklahoma, Texas, going to the SEC. And I'm actually surprised that we had to wait an entire year for the next big move. It's been no secret that USC is not long for the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 has a great commitment to academics. And, even during COVID-19, I think that had an impact on this decision as USC was looking around at conferences across the country playing some entire seasons. And even the Big Ten played more football than they did. So I think the USC for the last couple of years has been looking for an opportunity. And with the way the stars aligned, this seems to be the right time. And then who's next? I think there's a list, Amanda, of about 8 to 10 schools who consider themselves national powerhouses. And they're in the remaining conferences that are left over on the outside of these two super conferences that are now created. Clemson, I think, is the school at the top of that list. And it's not many other programs that are in their stratosphere, but there are a bunch who are right under that. Florida State, B. McEnany's alma mater, Miami, Oregon, Washington, Utah. There is a list of schools that are got to be calling up like crazy the Big Ten and the SEC and saying, hey, how can we make something work? What can we do? Like exhausting every single avenue. And if I was one of those schools, I would be doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, and with that being said, Danny, if that was to happen, if you talk about a hypothetical with potentially Clemson leaving the ACC and seeing what happened with Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12, and now currently the newest news with the Pac-12, I mean, basically college football will only consist of 2 conferences. I know, literally speaking, there are more than 2 conferences, but if that was to happen, my goodness, it's all about the SEC and the Big Ten, especially if the Big Ten can continue to add prestigious like teams, universities to their conference. But in all, this is a huge move for the Big Ten. mostly known as a Midwest conference, now being able to take their talents out to the West Coast. Look at the TV money that will come in with the Big Ten now adding two powerhouses from the Big 12 in Southern California. I mean, now the recognition. I mean, this is a massive move. The Big Ten, locally, money-wise, already just was bringing in a boatload of money, but now potentially adding UCLA and USC. My goodness. I mean, this is a huge day for the Big Ten. It's a huge day for the schools that were already involved, and it's a huge day for UCLA and USC as well.
PMAX, so let me ask you this, because a lot of praise for what the Big Ten now looks like. Are they on equal footing now with the SEC?
No question. No question. And think about this, Amanda. We're so football driven that we only oftentimes look at the football side of things. But when you factor in all athletics, all sports, right? The Big Ten is kind of in a league of their own. When you factor in hockey, softball, track, basketball, and add in those two powerhouses, when you look at the tradition and the prestige in which they're coming with as well, yes, they're right there with the SEC. And me personally, I know it was a big deal when Oklahoma and Texas decided to go to the SEC. And the SEC was already a powerhouse. I mean, that conference football-wise, they don't necessarily need to make that type of move to still be able to dominate college football. But it helped. But in this move right here, this takes the Big Ten to a whole nother level. And they needed to have this, they needed this to happen to be able to stay within that conversation. So yes, they're right there with the SEC, clearly when you talk about football. But if you talk in all sports, me personally, with the money that has been generated already from the Big Ten, I think they're still ahead of the SEC when you factor in all athletics, especially with this move today.
Here's the thing, BMAC, all athletics don't matter. It's about football and it's about basketball. And that one, I do think the SEC still has a pretty massive advantage there with the number of national championships they've had in those. And if you throw in baseball, it's really not even close. Now, this is what I think is a really solid counter punch to the move of Oklahoma, Texas last year. But I don't think it was there's no knockout blow, but there was one that I think would have been a little bit better. And it's a program that I did not include before when I gave you those 8 to 10 programs. If the Big Ten announced today they were adding USC and Notre Dame, I think that would have been the whole, and this is big. This is a jaw dropper. That would have been bigger. And I still think Notre Dame is out there as a potential option for the Big Ten. So if they were able to add Notre Dame as well, then I think it's okay. Now we can start having that conversation about SEC, Big Ten, equal footing in football and basketball and the major sports that are out there. So I still think there's plenty of moves left, though. I mean, to mention the two dominoes that have fallen so far, I don't know when we're going to start hearing these schools trickle in of who's going to be interested now, but I think it puts Notre Dame on the table, who has always been, they've worn their independence with such pride and arrogance even, that I think even they would be willing to start listening to the Big Ten if they came to the table. But they've got this pseudo relationship with the ACC as a sort of 1 foot in with all sports, half foot in with football, that I think Notre Dame even is a potential option for the Big Ten now.
So you got some keys out there. You got schools like Notre Dame, and Danny, you mentioned you think there are about 8 to 10 other schools that consider themselves powerhouses. With the way the Big Ten looks right now, with the way the SEC looks, Danny, you said if you're one of those schools, you're going to be knocking on the door of the Big Ten or the SEC. Is there any way, if you see either some of these conferences joining together, if somebody was able to get Notre Dame, where you feel like they could compete with what the Big Ten and the SEC look like now? Is there any way with those schools that are left out there that you could find some sort of equal footing?
Amanda, when the alliance was formed, I thought that was a really good move for all the conferences involved to kind of counter what the SEC did. But we've seen the alliance completely obliterated with this move, because the Pac-12, if you remember, was a part of it and was going to say, yeah, we're going to keep an eye on our members, and we're not going to poach anybody from you. And now all of a sudden they're joining up with the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 is. So I say the alliance is completely done. It's over. It's like the Death Star when it's exploded. It's gone. So I think for the other remainder, so the options are for the remaining conferences, for the other Power 5 schools, I really think the only avenue you could survive this in a big picture, like the whole movement of college football, where we're going, where I don't think we're going to stay at this 30-32 number with just the Big Ten and the SEC. But I do think if you took the Power 5 schools that remain, this kind of Power 65, if you'll call them, there would be strength in numbers, where if the ACC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 came together and said, but again, who do you trust now? Like if you had an alliance before, you're going to trust a new one? Not without a TV deal and not without a contract in place, because that was a handshake deal. But Amanda, I really think that's the only option on those teams to keep them relevant in the future of college football, is for the teams that aren't in the Big Ten or SEC and the forward movement of those two conferences to all combine collectively and say, we're going to make it a big three. We're going to make 3 super conferences. We're going to be one of those. And I still don't think they have the powerhouses that the Big Ten and the SEC does. But with the likes of Clemson, Oregon, Florida State, Miami, Washington, the remainders, they could at least make a compelling case. But I think that is a pipe dream, Amanda. I really think we're going to evolve into 2 super conferences.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think if you, Danny mentioned the hypothetical with the Pac-12, the Big 12, ACC kind of combining strength in numbers, no question, but yet and still the tradition, looking at how the programs in the SEC and the Big Ten have been relevant for such a long time. I don't think they still can compete. And I think the biggest domino for all of this, when you look at the outside conferences, the ACC, the Pac-12, and the Big 12, whatever conference is lucky enough to go get Notre Dame, now you have a little sigh of relief. And if I'm the ACC, number one, you can't afford to lose Clemson, Florida State. But as Danny mentioned, Notre Dame has been, straddling the fence a little bit, 1 foot in with the conference, 1 foot out doing their own thing when it comes to the independent side of things. If you can find a way to get Notre Dame to buy all the way in with the ACC, that would bring life to the ACC. But when it comes to the Pac-12 and the Big 12, I don't see any life happening, because I don't see Notre Dame considering any one of those conferences. The only 2 conferences I think Notre Dame would consider would be the ACC, because they're already kind of doing business with them, or the Big Ten. And if that happens, like Danny said earlier, if the Big Ten finds a way to get Notre Dame, they're cooking with gas. If you know your way around the kitchen, gas stoves are the best stoves to cook on.
B-Mac, let me ask you, look at Danny's laughing too. B-Mac, when it comes to Notre Dame, I mean, first of all, we don't know what the playoffs are going to look like in the future. I mean, that was tabled here, and we're going to see what it looks like, though. But for Notre Dame right now, is it best to stay independent, or do they need to make a move?
I mean, that's a great question, because with them being independent, they bring in so much money, have their own TV deal. But with that being said, also, they have all the leverage. They have all the leverage when it comes to negotiating at the table. Listen, you need us more than we need you. So how can you make this deal sweet for us to consider going to your conference? So that's the power that Notre Dame has. Maybe they can negotiate. If we go to the Big Ten, as a hypothetical, we go to the Big Ten, we keep our TV deal. We don't split anything with the other universities in the conference, or negotiate the same thing with the ACC. So that's the luxury that Notre Dame has, because they're in a good situation regardless. That's the Irish, right? That's the gold helmets that resonates throughout college athletics, especially on the football field. So that's the big domino. If I'm the Big Ten, if I'm the ACC, clearly if I'm the ACC, how can we make this thing become a reality? How can we get you guys to 100% join our conference? Either side needs to be right now dialing up every number that's important when it comes to this decision with Notre Dame, because whatever conference gets Notre Dame, I mean, Notre Dame is the biggest free agent among free agents when it comes to college sports. If whatever conference can get them, man, now that's a heavy hit, especially if the Big Ten is able to do that. That would clearly put the Big Ten, in my opinion, over the SEC if they can go out and get Notre Dame.
Yeah, Notre Dame is the wild card right now that I think everybody's eyeballs should be on. And if you're Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, you're probably right now speed dialing Notre Dame to try to talk a deal like you're talking about, convince them to come to the conference. You hope you're not getting a busy signal. I don't even know, do we do those anymore? I don't know if we get busy signals anymore. But I think you're calling Notre Dame. You're also calling Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, your three biggest football brands, trying to ensure that you might get busy signal again with them, though, as they're probably pursuing interest in the Big Ten or SEC, most likely the SEC. So Jim Phillips right now, the commissioner of the ACC, has got a lot on his plate. When it comes down to Notre Dame and the decision they're going to make, I think it comes down to two things. It comes down to money and it comes down to playoff access. In either of those situations, I think the biggest windfall financially is to join one of these super conferences. They've always been a strong brand in college football, but with how big and how massive these TV deals are going to be with either the Big Ten or the SEC, I don't think as a single entity Notre Dame would come even close. And then for playoff access, that's the other one where I think it's going to force their hand with these two super conferences. They still might have a part of it, but if they want to guarantee they're a part of it, I do think they're going to have to join a conference. So I think the days of Notre Dame being an independent may be drawing to an end.
Danny Cannell, Bryant McFadden, another day we did not see coming when it comes to the world of college football. But Danny, like you said, it took about a year to get here. So I'm not surprised it didn't happen a little bit earlier. Thank you guys so much. BMAC, if you did not know, has a podcast called All Things Covered. It is along with his cousin there, Patrick Peterson, latest episode talking to Darren Waller about his current contract situation, what he thinks the Raiders will look like this upcoming season, and be top 5 tight ends in the NFL.
Right now, USC has the number 11 ranked recruiting class in the class of 23, according to the composite. They do have a couple of 5 stars and 5 4 stars. And you see several other Big Ten and even another Pac-12 team on this list, the Washington Huskies. Let's take you out to the Elite 11 right now, and we've been there all week. This is Los Angeles. This is where it's all taking place. And this is part of the reason why we sent all you guys out there. Steve Wiltfong and Chris Singletary joining us, because we knew all along, Steve, that USC and UCLA were going to plan to leave for the Big Ten. I'm just kidding. It just kind of fell into our lap. Steve, start us off here on the immediate impact this could have in the world of recruiting.
Well, I'm not sure how immediate of an impact we're going to have here, because young men are starting to make their decisions going into their senior year, and there are kids that have USC near the top of their list. UCLA, they didn't host a prospect in June on an official visit, so they got a little bit different of a philosophy than most of the other schools in America right now. But time will tell, because obviously these programs are moving into a much more competitive conference from top to bottom. You have more bona fide playoff contenders, a legit national title contender every year in this conference. And then when you look at the NFL draft, there were nearly double the players in the Big Ten that were selected when you compare it to the Pac-12. So when a lot of these prospects are thinking about their college decisions, they want to play in big games, and they want to have an opportunity to play on Sundays. And the Big Ten, the track record for that is certainly much larger than what's going on in the Pac-12.
Chris, what do you think about the impact on recruiting?
I think long term, when you especially look at the 24, 25 classes, that's where you're going to see it pay dividends. You're thinking about a school like Michigan. I was fortunate enough, that's where I played. And we played with guys like Amani Toomer, Leon Hall. We also played with Tom Brady, of course. Just this past class in 22, Michigan signed 5 guys that either had West Coast ties directly to California, or either Idaho, Oregon, or Colorado. So now you open up that recruiting window back up, have a huge alumni base on the West Coast. Obviously, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to now branch out to get some of the best players in the country. And now, again, you're trying to be like the SEC from a standpoint where now you're able to put yourself in a conversation to potentially have 2 teams in the playoff by adding USC and UCLA. So I think the strength and the real outcome of this and the benefit will come down the line in 24, 25, and 26.
So, Steve, do you think this is going to help other Big Ten teams as well, recruiting in that fertile state of California?
Well, certainly now you have another inch to sell on the trail. If you're recruiting a kid out west, hey, we got a couple away games in your backyard, and recruiting's a game of inches, and you just never know what that extra bump is going to help you to get over the top. But I think when you're talking about Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State's got a top 5 class right now. Ohio State's number 2 in the country right now. It's kind of irrelevant to them. It's a small detail. Those programs are going to continue to recruit nationally as they already have, and it'll be up to USC and UCLA to kind of match those programs. The Big Ten is an incredibly physical football league, and these programs recruit at a high level at the point of attack. Iowa just landed a commitment from the number 1 ranked offensive tackle in the country, Caden Proctor. And then when you look at USC and UCLA, now UCLA did a good job in the transfer portal on the offensive front and in the front 7 on defense. And USC, they returned their entire offensive line, but I'm not sure if that's a good thing yet. We'll see how they mature under this new coaching staff. They really are going to have to beef up front at the point of attack to match what is already happening in the Big Ten, which is a smash mouth league.
Chris, you guys are out there for the Elite 11 right now. What has today been like walking around the premises as we started to get word that something big was going to happen, and then whispers and rumors that it could be another seismic shift? What's it been like to be there?
From this standpoint, you had the buzz, from the coaches on the sideline, from parents that have kids here participating. I don't really think the players know yet, because at the time that it really hit, the players were now starting the 7-on-7 and also starting the target competition. So I don't think they really have an idea, because they're in the midst of playing. I think once it's over and those guys really find out, the guys like Malachi Nelson, Makai Lemon, Deuce Robinson, then we'll be able to get an idea of how it affects them. But I'm kind of like Steve. The hay is in the barn for the most part with 23. Mm-hmm. This is really going to have ramifications, if any, when you look at 24 and 25, and what schools, for a school, for example, like Nebraska, which is kind of that border school. Now you open that up. At one point in time, a few years ago, Nebraska recruited California hard. Now I think this allows them to really go back and really, kind of use that as home base without having the state of Texas. And now you're also able to sell kids on the West Coast. We're going to come back home to the West Coast, and you're going to play either one game a year, whether it's either USC or UCLA. So I think that'll be a recruiting tool that a lot of schools will use.
This has been something that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, we had the huge news last year with Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC, but then there's so much volatility, Steve, in the world of college athletics. How are the kids handling this right now as they decide where to go?
Well, I think, again, when we're talking about the blue chip kids, they're trying to play on the biggest stage at a program that's going to allow them to compete at the highest level and be developed into the player they want to be. And so a lot of, when you look at the NFL draft, the SEC running away with that, the Big Ten running number 2, those are the programs that are getting the keen eye from a lot of the blue chippers. Now, you see USC, they have the number 11 ranked recruiting class in the country right now. We're used to seeing them that high. That's the level that we're expecting them to recruit at. But I want to see them recruit at a higher level around the line of scrimmage. But for the kids, all these things, I don't know how relevant this conference realignment is to them or whatever. The elite guys are still going to look at the elite schools, and then it will be up to those middle-of-the-road programs to evaluate well, develop, find guys that fit their scheme, and bring them up a notch or two to compete with those blue bloods that year in and year out are recruiting the top talent per se.
All right, Steve Wilfong and Chris Singletary right in the middle of all this today in Los Angeles at the Elite 11, saying some of the players on the field probably don't even know this is happening right now as they go through drills. Fellas, thank you so much as we continue our breaking news coverage with USC and UCLA planning to leave for the Big Ten and potentially beginning play in just a couple of years in their new conference. 24/7 Sports out there at the Elite 11 all week. They have your wall-to-wall coverage of recruiting rankings, transfer portal updates, and new conference updates as well.
Well, coming up next with the news that USC and UCLA now headed to the Big Ten. We've talked a lot about what it means for football, but what does it mean for basketball? We'll talk about that next.
threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
It's breaking news that doesn't just affect college football. This is college basketball. This is several other sports as well. USC and UCLA planning to leave the Pac-12 for the Big Ten. Now, the Big Ten has not had an NCAA men's basketball champion since Y2K. It was Michigan State back in 2000. They're going to be adding, likely, USC and UCLA, a team that made the Final Four a couple of years ago. Actually, just last year, USC made the Elite Eight a couple of years ago. So let's take a look at the college hoops impact here. We know football moves everything, but if there's a number two, it's men's college basketball. So let's bring in Adam Finkelstein, who covers college basketball at 24/7 Sports. Adam, what's the immediate impact here on college basketball with more shuffling of the deck and the Pac-12 going down to 10 and the Big Ten moving to 16?
Well, I think it's mostly about the Pac-12, because this is a conference that in the NCAA tournament over the last 5 to 8 years has had an inconsistent record. And there's been a lot of talk about, how good college basketball is on the West Coast versus the East Coast. And this is only going to add to that dialogue. And so I think the future of the Pac-12 conference and the repercussions in terms of which you see people like Arizona and Oregon, schools like that from a basketball perspective are exceptionally significant, not just on the West Coast, but nationally. What happens to those programs and what they do to kind of retaliate or consider moves of their own is certainly some of the buzz right at the moment.
Adam, how helpless are these major college basketball programs like Arizona in the Pac-12? You've got Kansas in the Big 12. When colleges, universities, conferences, TV networks are basically saying college basketball doesn't matter, this is all football driven.
Well, there's an East Coast precedent for basketball schools to have a path to survival, and that's the Big East Conference, because the Big East has made themselves a basketball-centric conference, and they've been able to survive realignment because of it, even getting schools like UConn back. So when you go, when you trace the roots of realignment to the very beginning, so much of it was schools departing the Big East for the ACC in football-centric moves. But again, the Big East kind of rallied around, initially it was those Catholic 7 schools, they dubbed themselves. They brought in 3 basketball heavy hitters. And then that you saw them bring back UConn in a move where UConn kind of sacrificed their football program to a certain extent in order to rejoin the Big East and concentrate on their basketball roots. So I do think there's a precedent on the East Coast. It's going to be interesting to see if it's the Pac-12 or someone else on the West Coast that kind of takes on a similar model and tries to replicate what the Big East has been able to do on the East Coast.
Yeah, and you've got the team out there that, not known for football at all. I don't even think has a football team, the Gonzaga Bulldogs, who've been the best college basketball team regular season-wise the last, 10, 20 years. Adam Finkelstein is with us here as we digest the news that USC and UCLA are likely moving on to the Big Ten and are looking to finalize that move and could begin play as early as 2 years from now in the Big Ten. Adam, what does this do for the Big Ten in particular, which has been so maligned over the last 20 years? We think they have a great, great conference one year, and they go into the tournament and they just can't get it done.
Yeah, they've been great from November to February. I mean, that's the bottom line. So I think, listen, they've got 2 more teams here that have had postseason success, that are going to be in a position to challenge for national championships. And I think what it does for their branding and the member schools who are already in the league and their ability to recruit nationally, it's only going to elevate that. The other reality, though, is, and we've seen this in realignment, there's going to be some negative repercussions for schools at the bottom of the conference. There's also going to be some positive implications for schools, now maybe at the top of the Pac-12, because not everybody can be a star in their conference. Think about a school, I talked about the Big East earlier. Think about a school like Providence. Nobody benefited more than Providence in the Big East after all those schools left to go to the ACC. So it's going to be interesting to see if somebody emerges on the West Coast similar to that. And even within the Big Ten, it's an oversimplification to say this is great news for everybody in the Big Ten. That's not necessarily the case. There are going to be some that are going to end up kind of rising up to be the cream of the crop. There's going to be others that kind of sink back down and have a harder time keeping up with the masses. So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic to follow, because I just don't think there's always levels within each individual conference.
UCLA, maybe the basketball program in college basketball history, moving conferences more than likely, with the news today that UCLA and USC are working on a deal to move to the Big Ten Conference and begin play as early as the 24 season. Adam Finkelstein with us here on HQ. You can read more from him at 247 Sports. And it's a place to be right now. I mean, they've got you covered out at the Elite 11, and that's where this is all happening in Los Angeles. We're hearing now that could be an announcement as early as sometime this afternoon or evening that this thing is official.